And now the director of Sunseed the Journey and today's host, Amartat Kohn.
Hello, everyone. This is Amartat Kohn, your host for today's Wisdom Talk number 15. I'm really excited for our program today with Professor Francis Clooney, an incredible scholar, teacher, leader, and a great human being. But first, I want to apologize for any of you who tried to connect to our program a few days ago. As you may have seen, we were having technical difficulties, and so we had to cancel the program and reschedule it for today. So please accept our apologies. And of course, fortunately, Professor Clooney was able to reschedule our talk, so we're re-recording it right now. And we're extremely grateful to him and you for joining us again on this Wisdom Talk. Before I begin, I just want to remind you that you can see all of our past Wisdom Talks. There's a whole lineup of fantastic teachers and mentors who you're going to be able to see during the past Wisdom Talks. You just go to our website, which is sunseed.org/Wisdom Talks. And while you're there, you can see the classic New Age movie Sunseed the Journey with the key spiritual teachers of the 1960s and 1970s. And that you can see by visiting just sunseed.org. And while you're there, please do register for our mailing list so you won't miss any of the exciting future programs we have and events and future Wisdom Talks, and eventually the new film Sunflower, which is in the works right now. And also, please, while you're there, check our Guru Shop on the website, because these Wisdom Talks are all offered to you for free, but it's really the merchandise that you purchase that helps us to be able to continue this work. So let's jump right in. Our guest today is a great thought leader and a professor of divinity and comparative religion at Harvard University. He's a Roman Catholic Jesuit priest. He's become an expert on Hinduism. He spent many years traveling and living in India. He met some of the great enlightening swamis, monks who are living there and continuing the Sanskrit tradition, which is literally thousands of years old. And he studied Sanskrit himself, so he could actually study the Hindu text in the original text. He's author of over 20 books on Hinduism and Christianity and interreligious learning, as well as blogging regularly since 2007. He's a really busy man, and we appreciate tremendously his time with us today. He's also a fellow of the British Academy and has just been selected as president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. So, Professor Clooney, welcome.
Thank you, Amartat. I'm delighted to be with you, that our technical difficulties of a few days ago have been conquered, it seems. And I'm really appreciating your inviting me to the show, and you're doing wonderful work, and I'm happy to be part of it today.
It's a great joy and honor, and congratulations to your recent becoming president of the Catholic Theological Society. We're so happy to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
At the end of this show, just to remind our audience to stay around to the very end, you're going to lead us in, I don't know whether you call it a contemplation or a meditation, but it's going to be I can't wait, because we all, we can talk, and this is a great stimulation for the mind, but when we get beyond the mind with contemplation or meditation, it's totally important for our life, as you know. Yes. So, and also, if you'd like to ask Father Clooney to answer any of your deepest questions, we're going to show you how you can write them in the chat right now, and he'll be giving them at a different date than today, and you'll get the most profound answers from this great scholar. So, Father Clooney, you grew up in an Irish Catholic family, and I assume you went to all Catholic schools. And apparently, you decided at an early age to become a priest. Were there any inner experiences or events that happened that sort of pushed you in that direction, or people you met that influenced you?
Yes, a very basic question, I think, to start with. So I'd say there's the kind of inside and outside of the story, why I entered the seminary when I had just turned 18 years old in 1968. On the outside is, as you say, I'm growing up Irish Catholic, Brooklyn, New York City, going to a Catholic school taught by the nuns, the wonderful nuns throughout grammar school, then going to Regis High School, a Catholic Jesuit school in Manhattan, and learning Greek and Latin and kind of being an altar boy along the way and other church-related activities. For a certain kind of young man in those days, the 1960s, one obvious option, one honorable path to take was to become a priest. And there were plenty of vocations in the years before 1968, and I was part of that flow, you might think. The other side of it, though, was why me? Because of my classmates in high school, maybe 150 of us in the school, I was the only one in that Jesuit class of Jesuit students in the Jesuit college, high school, who entered the seminary. And I think the reason was that I did have, as you alluded to, a very definite experience of God that kind of pushed me over the boundary. So when I was 15 years old, on one summer night, a very strong sense of God's presence, God, as it were, reaching in and touching me in my heart. And this experience of God, which was very immediate, short, powerful, raised for me the question, if this is what God is like, what shall I do with my life? And there are many answers to that question, what shall I do with my life? But I found that for me, in the context I was in, that experience of God said, obviously, you should become a priest. You're at a Jesuit school, become a Jesuit. And 54 years later, I'm still a Jesuit. So it started then, but it was that push of kind of inner experience that pushed me to do what many of my classmates were not doing at that time.
And also, this was during I guess, the late 60s, early 1970s. And you said that, you told me before, that many of the people, even who went to the seminary, never made it through because it was such a tumultuous time.
Oh, yeah. It was a great time of change in the Catholic Church. It was after the Vatican Council, 1962 to 65. Things were opening up and changing. Pope, who's now St. John the 23rd, said, let us open the windows and let fresh air into the church. But for many men and women who were priests and nuns already, and many in seminary, imagining other lives for themselves, working wonderful lives as lay people, serving the community through all kinds of ministries. And then people were beginning to explore other faith traditions as well. And some become Buddhist, some become Hindu, some follow a Sufi path, and so on. All of this going on. So in my class of seminary, there were 17 of us who entered on the same day, and about 13 left within 2 or 3 years. So it was quite a dramatic drop. And that was not considered a failure. It's just that people need to try it and then realize they're called to something else.
Absolutely true. And actually, we're going to be talking a little bit later about how studying another religion can actually reinforce your faith. But you were very fortunate to have been given this gift of faith when you think you said 15. Mm-hmm. But many people today don't even have a religious upbringing where God has spoken in the family. They go to church or some other location where there's regular teachings of the religion. Mm-hmm. And today many people can't even accept the concept of religion or any sort of an omnipotent, all pervasive being. How can one acquire faith in today's modern world if it's not in your cultural upbringing?
I think that's a really good question, and that relates back to what I said earlier, that sort of the outside of a vocation and the inside of a vocation. And I think compared to the 1960s, the outside has fallen apart. And that the whole cultural flow of, again, the Catholic school, the nuns, the priests, being an altar boy and all that, so much of that has fallen away. And so many young people in the United States today do not grow up with a solid single tradition to which they belong. Some certainly do, and that's a wonderful thing. But others, their parents, baby boomers, were searchers. Things changed along the way. The rhetoric and the cultural frame of Catholicism or other traditions isn't there anymore. And I think it's really a hard job and a challenge for young people who are knowing that they want to be spiritual, they have this thirst for something divine, how to frame that, what to do with your life. And for many young people, they don't think immediately, I think I'll become a seminarian or I'll become a nun. There are reasons why that doesn't work. But I would think that still, I'm an optimist, and that the inside of vocation still works. That I'm a believing Christian, I would say, therefore use God language, that God still speaks to individuals. God still touches people in their heart of hearts, but sometimes that needs translation because people may be thinking it's going to look like this, but it actually looks like that. Or God is trying to get through and the culture makes it almost impossible to hear the voice of God. And so I think it's a tricky thing that God is still speaking to us. And yet for so many people, the cultural frame has collapsed and they can't hear that call from God when it comes.
Interesting. So, I mean, many of our viewers, I guess you could say, have seen my movie Sunseed the Journey, where there are many different paths that lead the person to wanting to get the answers, the deepest answers about life. I mean, I think that's what most people really want.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Oh yeah, and I think on the one hand, I mean, I think if we're just talking about Americans, let's say at the moment, United States, more than ever before in history, there is a realization of the aliveness of these other religious paths, and that being a Catholic, being a Christian, is accompanied by, and people can see other ways. I could become a practitioner of a Buddhist tradition. I could follow a Hindu Swami. I could make yoga the center of my spiritual life. I could become a pious Jew. All kinds of things going on. I could practice a form of Chinese meditation. All these things are going on. And we not only read about these things in books anymore, but rather our neighbors are people of other faith traditions, either Americans who've converted to Asian traditions, let's say, or our neighbors from around the world, and seeing people, how they pray, how they worship, how they're spiritual is a much more vivid reality now than it was 50 years ago. And so the opportunities are all there. And because, as you say, I mean, people don't grow up with a single-minded tradition they belong to, then being in college, being a young person in their 20s, let's say, there's so many ways one can experiment and say, I want to be spiritual, let me find my spiritual path. And people look around and try different things, and then hopefully eventually settle and say, all right, this is where I'm going. This is what I find is my spiritual life.
So this is probably you probably discussed this a lot among other Christian leaders, what the church needs to do to become more accessible and relevant to the present and future generations.
Oh, I think that's a big challenge. I mean, you know, if we think of any organization, any institution in an age when, rightly, in many cases, there's so much suspicion about authority structures, about institutions that have failed their members, about scandals. I don't need to go into detail on scandals in the churches, old and new, and also just simply the way in which large institutions, you could talk about, you know, a large corporation, you could talk about parts of the United States government, are like these massive creatures that find it very hard to change. There's some kind of fixing of framework, inability to change, to keep up with the times. And there's no reason to think that the Catholic Church as an institution can suddenly change itself, adapt itself. But what is really required, I think, is that institutions which see themselves in the long run, the long term, and the Catholic Church with its 2,000-year history can take its time. It can't demand change in itself right away. Really has to be paying attention and listening to people either of Catholic faith or who used to be of Catholic faith, and saying, where is it that God is working among the people of God today? And it requires, as with individuals, self-scrutiny. Take a good look in the mirror and say, are we just saying things, or are we actually doing what we say? Are we showing people a path, or are we just giving them advice that's not very spiritual? How does that all work out? And then to be able to show people, and I think this is an issue with an organization like the Catholic Church, that Catholicism has actually a very vibrant spiritual tradition. If one goes back and reads, let's say in the Middle Ages, read the great mystics of Christian tradition, Meister Eckhart, Nicholas of Cusa, Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, then later John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and other saints. These are great masters of the spiritual life, and they're very much part of Catholic tradition. But sometimes in the business of running churches in the 20th century, 21st century, all that kind of gets pushed to the side, and we do this, we do this, we do this, and then forget about giving people what they really need, which is the nourishment of their spiritual lives. So it's not that the Catholic Church is lacking such things entirely, but it may too often neglect them and forget about them and push other agenda items that don't really give people what they're looking for. Even if everything went perfectly, I think people would still be choosing multiple paths in our 21st century. But nonetheless, we have the resources to do better. And I think that's a challenge to the Catholic Church, Protestant churches, to Muslim communities, Jewish communities, Buddhist and Hindu and all that, to keep up with the times and keep up with where young people are.
There is a deep tradition in Christianity for direct God experience. And this is, I think, what attracts me and many people to other directions, because we're yearning for that experience that we call beyond words, wherever that unity is. I mean, even and part of the problem seems to be that the church has, and the other institutions to a great extent, have lost the force of reinforcing this direct experience. And I think Christ said in John, I and them and you in me, that they may become completely one. So,
yeah. And I think I'm definitely not a bishop and not in the hierarchy. I am a priest, but I'm very sympathetic with leaders, because I think leaders often realize that their job is to provide structures. Because if we have no structures in our life, no institutions and no routines, often the ideals of the spiritual life kind of just fade away, because we need habits, we need good habits. And I think, the Catholic Church, but it could be another religious community, is right to have the Mass, to have the sacraments, to have ways of prayer, to have preaching, to have other forms of devotion, and to keep those going, because just as we have bodies as well as souls, we need structures in some way. They have to be critiqued. But there's always the temptation, and I think you see this in every tradition, to confuse those structures and habits with the inner life within them. So just as if somebody, when somebody passes away, one body and soul, flesh and blood, alive, and then the breath is gone, the life is gone, and you have the body still there for a while, you can still feel it, you can still see it, and yet it's dead. And institutions, I think, can be in risk of dying off if they're not infused with a spirit that keeps them alive. You don't want spirit without a body. You don't want spirit without an institution, I don't think. But nonetheless, it has to be alive and constantly renewed by breathing in, breathing out, bringing new life. As they said, Pope John the 23rd said, open the windows, let fresh air into the church. Otherwise, it's going to suffocate.
Well, I know this is one of the things that attracted you to Hinduism, and so let's switch a little bit and talk about your dedication to studying Hinduism, and how did that come about, first of all?
Well, it came about almost by accident, to tell you the truth. So after my entering the seminary in 1968, doing the Jesuit training, which is a 10-year course in those days between entering the seminary and being ordained a priest. It used to be 15 years before my time. So it's a long course of study, philosophy study, theology study, and so on like that. So I did my first novitiate training. Then I did my BA in philosophy study at Fordham University in New York. But then there was the question of a period of 2 or 3 years before the study of theology, which is given over to some kind of practical ministry. And usually for young Jesuits in the 1960s and 70s, it would mean going and teaching in a high school, let's say in Manhattan or up in Buffalo or in Jersey City, in my area. Go and teach in the school and teach things and teach the boys and, do that kind of work. But it was, I think, by the grace of God that I heard at a conference in, I think, the end of 1971, a priest from the Philippines, Father Horatio de la Costa, gave us a speech. He was a very well-known historian. And he said to us, a couple of hundred Jesuits gathered to hear him speak, if you think of yourself as a Jesuit, think of yourself as part of a global reality. To be a Jesuit is to have a heart as large as the world. Don't narrow you down and say, I'm a New Yorker only, I'm from Brooklyn only, I'm from California only. No, be broad, be open. And that suddenly struck me as like not a warning so much as a wake-up call, telling me, you grew up in New York City, your path is going to be probably to go back and teach in one of those high schools in Manhattan, the same school you went to maybe. Why not do something different and find out the rest of the world? So with the blessing of superiors, and I'm always grateful that they'd let me look around, I thought maybe I could go to somewhere in Latin America. We had connections in the Philippines or the Caroline Islands in the Pacific. There was a new Jesuit place opening up in Nigeria. So I looked around, but I realized for no good reason at the time that what I really wanted to do was go to India. And I wasn't a scholar of Hinduism, and I hadn't majored in comparative religion in college or anything. But I think on some primal level, I was looking for a great civilization, a very old civilization, in which I could also meet the realities of then the 20th century, a complicated democracy with rich people, but many, many poor people, to be there kind of in a reality outside the US context and meet great religious traditions at the same time. To put it simply, I was a great admirer, as everybody else was, of Mother Teresa and Mahatma Gandhi. And saying, well, look, those are figures I could learn from. And I actually was blessed to be in the same room with Mother Teresa once in Calcutta, I think in the end of 1973. But I had this kind of instinct, let's go to India. As it turned out, I didn't really go to India because 73, it was very hard to get a visa to India if you had any kind of missionary connection, whatever, and I was going to be teaching as a seminarian. So I ended up going to Kathmandu, Nepal, up in the Himalayas. The king of Nepal, King Tribhuvan, around 1950, had invited the Jesuits in to set up a school because he wanted to open up the country and have education. His son, the future King Mahendra, had gone to a Jesuit school in India. So he called the Jesuits in Patna in India and said, Father, would you come up and set up a school? And therefore, I easily got a visa into Kathmandu, a spectacularly, breathtakingly beautiful place in the 1970s. It's about 5,000 feet high, surrounded by hills of about 10,000 feet. And off to the north are the high mountains, the highest mountains in the world. And from a certain place on the roof of the school, you could see Mount Everest on a clear day. So there I was, suddenly age 22, in Kathmandu in the fall of 1973. And I found myself in a classroom teaching boys from, let's say, we'd say about 6th grade to 10th or 11th grade. All the boys were Hindu and Buddhist. And there I was in the classroom, this young American Catholic, in an existential situation. Anyone who's ever taught high school knows that it can be a real challenge. And there I was in the classroom, and they realized I wasn't that much older than they were. So they were going to test me and see if I could really teach, and test me and see how my discipline was and so on. So it was hard, but we got along marvelously. But what it began to do was open the door that I couldn't teach them unless I could learn from them. And to learn from them had to be to understand, what does it mean to be a young Hindu or a young Buddhist in 1970s Kathmandu? And everything started from there. But it wasn't a plan, I will now become a religion scholar or I will do comparative religion. I end up in Kathmandu, everyone I'm teaching is Hindu and Buddhist, and it goes from there.
Can you tell us a little bit about your encounter with Mother Teresa?
Well, it was far less sensational than one might hope. As I said, I was in Kathmandu. There was a reason somebody was driving to Calcutta from Kathmandu in December of 73. And he was a diplomat, I think, an Australian diplomat. And he wanted a companion, somebody to talk to on the long, long drive down to the plains of India and then across to Calcutta. So I was asked to go with him. And it was marvelous because it was my first real experience in North India. And I got to Calcutta and then had a few days. I was staying at St. Xavier's on Park Street, the famous Jesuit college in Calcutta. And what I instinctively wanted to do wasn't so much directly to meet Mother Teresa, but to be part of her work at the Home for the Dying. So I went over, in fact, it was close enough from St. Xavier's, I could walk to the great Kali temple. And right next to it in the old guest house was Mother Teresa's Home for the Dying. So I walk in, and I think lots of young people were doing this in the 70s saying, I'm here, can I do something to help? And I recall mopping floors, secondly, cutting up vegetables to make the soup, and cleaning tables. They knew I was only going to be there a few days, so I didn't do direct work with the sick and the dying. But I was doing all this other stuff. And one day, again, it's not very dramatic, Mother Teresa comes in with a group of, I think, maybe American men and women who probably were donors or benefactors. And she's showing them around, and I'm standing on the other side of the room with my mop. And I couldn't think of any elegant way to drag the mop across the floor and come up to Mother Teresa and say, hello, Mother Teresa, I've always wanted to meet you. So I just watched her across the room and went back to mopping the floor. But it was a privilege and a grace for me to be in the room and to see how her vision of finding Christ among the poor was working out, and that by holding that mop, I was doing my little bit to further her great vision.
I think she had just like one overpowering experience, just as you did. It wasn't something that I don't know, you can tell us if it's come back for you, but I think in her writing, she said it was just one time.
Yeah, I mean, I think she thought her spiritual life was established. She came to India. She was working in this very wonderful school in Calcutta, a girls' school, a very good girls' school. But when she was coming back from her retreat one year, suddenly there on the train, she had a sense of leave the convent, go out into the streets and find me, Christ, among the poorest of the poor. And it took great courage for her, not to say, oh, wait, I'm already doing good work. I'm here at the school. That's good enough. But to leave that behind and leave the convent, a young woman, go out on the streets and start, without any money, without any building, without anything, start helping the poorest of the poor. And she did say, and you're perfectly right, that she said, some people think that I, Mother Teresa, have all these mystical experiences and voices of God and all that. Nope, that was about it. And that basically, I think the message was, you will find me in the poor that you care for. When I'm hungry, you'll feed me. When I'm thirsty, you'll give me to drink. And you will take care of me. But she never claimed to have a whole series of mystical experiences. It was, I think, I really believe that I think maybe one experience of God is more than enough for one lifetime. Because it's God, it's an infinite experience, even if it's only for a minute or less.
And so you went on to study Hinduism and scriptures and back and forth to India many years. Mm-hmm. That would be, we could spend an hour just probably talking about those experiences. But some people reject studying other religions because they fear people will change or drop the religion of their origin. As you mentioned, many people have done that over the last, since the 60s for sure. How can interreligious exchange and study actually further one's own faith?
Well, I mean, the objection comes from different angles. One would be, if you want to know a religious tradition, you have to be there. You have to be a practitioner of it. Why would you want to retreat to the library and open the books and study the books? What is that for? But I was a very scholarly person. I'd learned Latin and Greek in high school and had all the instincts of a bookish person. And after my 2 years in Kathmandu, when I was thinking, now what am I going to do with my life? And I could have stayed there the rest of my life. They would have, the fathers there would have allowed me to come back and study, teach there until now. If I was still alive, that would be all these years. But I was, as an inquiring intellectual, and I wanted to learn things and understand things. And I had a great sense that my experience in Kathmandu was changing the way I was an American Catholic. That seeing the subcontinent, seeing India, seeing Nepal, seeing the poor, seeing the multiplicity of religious possibilities meant I couldn't go back to New York or to Boston and be the same as I was. So I had to study it, and my way of doing it was to learn from the books. And I think some people wrongly kind of say either experience or study, read the books or have direct experience. I think study can be a direct experience because you have these wonderful traditions, you have sacred scriptures, you have commentaries, you have the rituals around them. And the books are meant in whatever language they're in, Sanskrit and Tamil are the two Indian languages I've studied most, but they open up the realities as the Bible does for Christians, as the Bible does for Jewish people, as the Quran does for Muslims and so on. So I got into that kind of study because I wanted to go deep into it, and that was my way, not everybody's way. But you're right, the other side of it was, isn't this dangerous? And it's almost as if to say ignorance is bliss. That the less you know about other religions, the better off you'll be, because actually then you won't be tempted to join them.
I think a lot of people feel that way, that they just don't want to open themselves up, or certainly that some of their teachers don't want them to open it up.
Right, and then that's the rhetoric of forbidden books, banned books. Don't read those things; they're dangerous for you. And I don't trivially say that everybody should read everything, because maybe sometimes people are not ready to read. And, if they pick up a book that they have no spiritual grounding in relationship to, it could be misunderstood and could be dangerous and so on. But I think the idea of protecting my faith by closing my mind was not a great idea. And the idea that my faith will survive over the decades as long as I don't learn anything is an insult to faith, because faith should be vibrant. Faith should be functioning with an open heart and an open mind. And I found, in 1975, when I studied theology, when I went for my PhD, University of Chicago, starting in 1979, that this kind of expansion of my knowledge and reading and learning was somehow parallel to spiritual development, spiritual opening, and that these go together, and that somehow going deeper together, opening up together, was actually conducive to being a better Catholic and a better Christian than I would have been probably. You never know what would your life be had you lived it otherwise. Of course, that's hard to say, but somehow that all these years, I've been studying Hinduism, almost 50 years now. And as I said, I'm 54 years a Jesuit. So most of my Jesuit life, I've been connected to Hinduism in some way. And I'm still a priest. I still go to a parish and say Mass on Sunday. I still find myself a disciple of Christ, a companion of Jesus. And that I think the way that has worked out for me was the opening of the wealth and the wisdom of Hindu tradition enabled me to be a better Christian. And I would say that would be true for many people if they were willing to try it. You just have to do it well. You have to stick with it. You have to be patient. You have to learn. You have to realize, I don't understand things. I have to try again. But it's like a physical, it's like doing yoga, let's say. I can't do that position. I can't sit that way. But if you keep at it, you can. And if you really want to learn into religiously, you can. You just have to be patient and take the time that is required.
And of course, this was all, let's say, within reference to that original experience you had that was all powerful. So your faith was locked in, so to speak, in your life.
Well, I think as with many religious people, and people experience the divine in different ways, is that somehow the theory that God is watching over us becomes an existential reality. That if one has an experience of God, well, then what happens to me in my life is not so much God, making it happen like I'm an automaton, but God is opening pathways for me, and that I shouldn't be afraid of what God puts before me. And so becoming a Jesuit, going to Kathmandu, studying at the University of Chicago, these could all be explained, by other explanations, even, by secular explanations and so on. But as I saw it, this is my vocation. And the Lord is opening these paths before me. Why would I be afraid to take the path that God is giving me? And see that's the will of God. And God's will is not you simply obey, but you try your best to do what you think God is asking you to do. And if that leads you across religious boundaries, then don't be afraid. Go. Do
That's
it.
lovely. But it gets a bit sticky, right? When you look at some of the basic assumptions of different religions that are maybe in conflict with each other. For instance, what is the Christian and Hindu view of what happens after death? Maybe you can explain each and how you can balance these two beliefs without conflict.
Well, to do that properly, it probably needs several lifetimes to explain all of that in a simple way, because it's a big, complicated question. But in brief, let me just say, on the one side, I think the Christian tradition, which is very much indebted to the Jewish tradition of God's work with the people of Israel, is a sense that this lifetime is given us as our opportunity to make our way from slavery to freedom, to find the will of God, to do what the Lord is asking of us, and that one is on earth for 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, 70 years, 90 years, whatever, and that this period is given you in order to find as best you can God, and then you enter into eternal reality. If I was speaking about this maybe 50, 70 years ago, I would say then you are faced with the stark choice of heaven and hell, eternal joy or eternal damnation. And I think for the most part, the Catholic Church today doesn't see it that way, but rather saying the mystery of our incomplete life and doing what we can opens up into the mystery of God after we die. And that you have one life and it opens up. If you've been a sinner, and some people are awful people and do awful things, that may take them much longer to get closer to God. But a sense that still the life you are given is the life you need to find your way to God. And it'll happen more after death. Hindu and Buddhist traditions, I think, seem to have it. It's impossible to generalize because these are large, long, complicated traditions, is that one life is too short. And that really, like the seasons of the year, like the cycles of nature, we find ourselves in a body, we find ourselves in a certain physical reality in which you couldn't possibly, in one body, in one life, realize yourself spiritually. And so at death, what you think of as yourself, your physical body, your psychology, your memory, your ego identity, all of that kind of crumbles. And your true self, if you're speaking on the Hindu side, the eternal self, goes through this process of being reborn, burning off bad karma, good karma, and in another life has another chance to get clearer on self-knowledge, clearer on the knowledge of reality, and so on. And I think there'd be a Buddhist analog to that. For most Hindus that I know in devotional traditions, they say you're kidding yourself if you think that you can be reborn in a cycle that leads to perfection, because you're never going to be perfect. So at some point after some lifetime, you realize either I have to realize that all of this is not who I am the eternal self, or throw yourself down at the feet of God, who will lift you out of what's called samsara, the cycle of birth and death, and you will be free. But I think the main difference in that you're really pointing to is that for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, for the most part, there may be exceptions, believing you have the gift of one life on earth, you make the best of it, and then you are judged by the mercy of God. Whereas for Hindus and Buddhists, no, our life story is much longer than one body, and you come back again and again. So what do we do with this? I mean, there's a contradiction there, and we can't say, if we say both are just fiction anyway, it doesn't matter which novel, which fiction you're talking about. But I think we're not responsible, to put it simply, I'm not God. I'm not in a position where I have to sit on the throne and make judgments about one life, many lives. But as a believing Christian, I see this is the life given me, but I have no compulsion to seek out Hindus and Buddhists and tell them why they're wrong, or tell them that it's impossible, or to argue with them, but rather to get to know people, understand their spiritual journeys, and then share some of that journey, whatever we think happens after death, without coming to any judgment to say it's only one life, of course it's many lives, you're both right, you're both wrong. It's more of an existential finding a way to be spiritual in the life we happen to be living right now.
Yeah, I spoke with Swami Sarvapriyananda recently, and he says very clearly, well, whether there's another life or not, your work is in this one.
Yeah, right. Exactly? What's there right before you? The next step you have to take. The next morning you have to get up. You do what you can in the life you have, and that somehow has eternal value. Yeah.
And fortunately, we have him coming on actually as our next Wisdom Talk guest on July 6th. So for our viewers who are watching, be sure you come back with us on July 6th. How can a Christian accept, let's say, the validity of another faith if they feel the desire and to convert that person to a Christian view of God and Christ?
Well, I think we have to allow individuals, including proselytizing Christian individuals, some scope for practicing their faith. And so on the one side, I think today it's absolutely essential not to go around attacking other people's faith traditions, not go around demeaning them or calling them mere superstition or from the devil and so on like that. I don't think that works. I think it's abusive and also untrue and also counterproductive. But I think if somebody is a believing Christian who reads clearly the New Testament, which says, go forth and share the good news with all people, or go forth and baptize in every nation, I cannot, as a Christian, tell my fellow Christians, don't share Christ with people elsewhere. Don't talk about Christ, to your friends or your strangers. Don't talk about Christ in other parts of the world. But I think the way of doing it can be either heavy-handed. I come in and tell you you're going to hell unless you accept Jesus as your savior, or as recent popes, Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis say, sharing Christ is like sharing what you think is most beautiful and most deep in your heart. And if you have a friend, you won't withhold from them what you find to be beautiful or true or lovely or good. And if it can be done on that level, you get to know somebody. You don't just go up to strangers and start talking to them, but rather you get to know people of other faith traditions, and you share with them your heart of hearts and say, well, look, this is who Jesus is for me. And I ask you to think about Jesus, understand Jesus, find what Jesus means for me, but also for you. But the reciprocal side of that often has to be if somebody wants to come to me and say, you should be knowing more about Krishna, or you should sit down and study the Holy Quran, then I can't logically say, oh no, I'm here to share with you, but I'm not interested in what you share with me. So I think it would be a mistake to say no efforts to bring the faith I have to other people, because then we'd all retreat into our little fortresses. All the Christians in one fortress, and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists all in their place, nobody talking to anybody because nobody wants to interfere, but rather conversations that are ongoing across all these boundaries, where I share what's within me, you share with what's in you. We don't have to agree with one another. There's no deadline saying you must accept this by a certain date. If it's forced on people, it doesn't seem very spiritual. But the ability to be able to learn and listen to people of another faith tradition and say, who am I? I should be able to stop, listen to you when you talk to me about your faith. And if I can't do that, why do I think that people will listen to me when I have something to say?
Well, I hope people are around the world will follow that philosophy, because it will help a lot with the terrible conflicts we have because of religious differences or wars
Yeah.
and everything.
Oh, I think so. I mean, and I would say, on the individual scale, I've been talking about individuals, but I can have sympathy with faith traditions, communities within any tradition that feel themselves genuinely threatened, and that a secular world or the hostility of a larger tradition around me seems to be undercutting everything we believe in. And I don't want to be a romantic and say, oh, don't worry about it, everything will work out, because sometimes you do have to stand up and say, this is what I believe and I cannot back down. And I think it's fair enough for individuals and communities to say that we have to stand up for our faith. But I think being a Christian and also thinking, though, of strands of other faith traditions, that if it comes a matter that I will defend my faith by using force, or I will violently push back the other, there's something wrong with that. That, the power to protect, the power to heal, the power to grow is in the hands of God, not in some sword or gun that I hold in my hand. And forcing people religiously, I think, cannot come from God.
Amen. So as a teacher, you're at Harvard University. You have some of the most brilliant students in the world that you're talking to and learning from and teaching to. As a teacher, what are some of the questions most asked by your current students about the religious life?
Well, you're right. I mean, I'm very grateful to have wonderful students at Harvard Divinity School where I teach. As you mentioned at the beginning, for 21 years, I taught at Boston College, the Catholic Jesuit University nearby, about 4 or 5 miles away from here. And I had wonderful students there. And I was blessed with wonderful students, undergraduate and grad students at BC. And now at Harvard, I'm also blessed mainly with grad students. We have a 2-year master's program, a 3-year Master of Divinity program, but also students from other departments in the college come over and so on and take courses. And I think it's obviously a rarefied part of Harvard University, which is not a religiously affiliated university. And there'd be many people, God bless them, I would say, who come to Harvard without a religious thought in their head and leave without a religious thought in their head. And either their faith is private and off campus, or they grew up in a secular culture and they do what they do and they do it well. But at the Divinity School, it's a great kind of experiment where young people, most of our students, as you might expect, are in their 20s or 30s. Sometimes we have students 50 years old, 60 years old. Recently, I met a student who's pushing 70, who come and are trying to understand their faith, working with great scholars of different religious traditions, learning languages, doing practical work, ministries of various sort. But I think deep in the midst of all that, for our students who are paying attention, is how shall I be a spiritual person in the 21st century? So that's sort of what they come with. And therefore, when you get students in class, you don't have to persuade them you should take the spiritual seriously. No, they're here because they take the spiritual seriously. But when you say, well, what questions are they asking? I think increasingly what I find to be the question is, on the one hand, does it make sense to go back and learn from classical religious traditions in the 21st century? So there have been debates over the classics. Different universities have debated the classics. Are the classics dead? It could be Homer and Plato and Aristotle and Virgil and Horace and so on, or the classics of religious literature, the Bible, for instance. Can you go back and study these classics, either with the problem that they're from long ago and they don't live in the world in which, they're not written for our time and place, or because they were tainted by oppressive structures, or they were patriarchal and we hardly ever hear the voices of women in some of these great texts? Can you still go back and learn? And my role, and certainly not all of our faculty, but my role is to try to say, yes, we can learn from these traditions. We have something to learn from the past. We can go back and learn. It just is hard work. So don't give up on doing it. The other main question, and there are more questions certainly, but the other main question, so one question is, can we learn from the past, and why should we bother doing so? The other question is, you, Professor Clooney, you are always talking about going from your own faith tradition to the other and coming back, and this kind of crossing over and coming back. And you can talk, as I have today, about how I'm a better Catholic priest because of having learned from Hinduism. But so many of them say, and we talked about this before, I don't come from a coherent tradition. I didn't grow up, they'll tell me, in a Catholic framework with nuns teaching me and priests teaching me. I didn't grow up Baptist. I wasn't this, I wasn't that. Kind of a search. When you say you begin where you are, cross to the other and come back, how can you call that spiritual? Or what kind of process is it if you don't have a home tradition? And I think with that, what I often tell them is, all right, you may not identify as 100% Catholic or 100% Presbyterian or 100% Orthodox Jew and so on. However, you do come from somewhere. You were born somewhere, you have a cultural context, you're here in a divinity school because you have some kind of spiritual yearning, some kind of spiritual longing. Why are you here? Who are you that have chosen to be here and not in the business school and not in the law school? And if you begin to say, who am I, who am here, then you do come from somewhere. And it may not be, like me, Irish Catholic New York studying Hinduism, but it may be a much more complicated background studying Hinduism, a much more complicated life brought to the study of the scriptures of Islam, or the scriptures of Judaism, and so on. So I think those are two of the main questions. Why study the past, and what happens if you don't have a tradition? And I try to answer them as best I can.
There's a tendency of many of young people, but all over, I won't limit it by age, to be spiritual but not part of any religion. Do you see this as a trend, and can religions adapt, do you think, to draw people back into a more structured religious experience?
Well, I think, I'm not a sociologist of religion, and I don't do statistics and so on, but I do think that most surveys show us that participation in mainline churches, let's say, is declining and has been declining for the last 40 years. And so many young people, including young people I know very well in my own family, my relatives and so on, are simply, not going to church anymore. They're not participating in institutional religion. And yet I think almost invariably, they want to be good people. They believe that there's something beyond crass material achievements. They don't believe that money is the only thing in life, or sex is the only thing in life, or power is the only thing in life. They want something more. And I can see various reasons. Again, we could, go through a list of horrors about what different religious organizations, including Christian churches, have done. Colonial abuses, sex abuse crisis, and so on, treatment of women and traditions and all that. There are all kinds of reasons why young people would say, why should I put up with that? And why should I bother with that? But I think on the one hand, if we say, can the religions catch up? Can religious structures adapt themselves to the new environment? I mean, it's not like a corporation that says, we used to make buggies, or we used to make kinds of furniture that nobody uses anymore, so we go out of business. Or we make machines that nobody uses anymore. Religions are not like that. Religions have been reinventing themselves for thousands of years because they actually are spiritual as well as material. So on the one hand, I think the religions, as we said earlier, I think have to be humble enough, the leaders, to listen to their young people and take the criticism seriously and not give pat answers or hierarchical answers, but realize that we need to be learning. And I think figures, in my own tradition, like Pope Francis, make abundantly clear that being Pope doesn't mean he has all the answers, but it does mean that he should be able to listen to people and their problems and their journey, and as best he can as a man in his 80s to try to do something to open things up. But I think the other side is also true. Can you really be spiritual without a religious tradition? And I'm a little bit skeptical in the long run. In the short run, it seems to work. I'm spiritual, I'm eclectic, I try this, I try that, I have a virtuous life. But do most of us really think that we can, when I'm 20, when I'm 40, when I'm 60, when I'm 80, can simply be this kind of spiritual being without the habits and structures of a tradition in place? Because if the structures of a tradition are not in place, if I'm not a practicing Buddhist or a practicing Catholic or whatever, then you can be a practicing secular American or a practicing consumer or a practicing member of this political party or that political party. You're going to end up being part of something. And I think the danger would be in rejecting organized religions is that you end up with something that is not only no better, but actually may be more counter to the spiritual life. So I think on both sides, and I have hope about I think our young people are wonderful, facing problems that I didn't have to face at that age, that allowing young people to use their good sense as well as their good hearts will realize that they need communities, they need structures, they need habits of learning, and that it's really naive to think, if I am sincere, I will change the world. You have to be sincere, but you also have to have communities that do things together.
I made this movie years ago called Sunseed, and it's now out as Sunseed the Journey, where my focus was really to show the many different traditions and the truth of all of them. And we're now starting to do a new movie we're going to call Sunflower, which will carry this into today's world. But one of the keys that seems to be attractive to young people and to all of us actually is the mystical approach to finding the truth within that tradition. I think you told me that Karl Rahner, a major Catholic theologian, said the devout Christian of the future will either be a mystic, one who's experienced something, or he will cease to be anything at all.
Yeah, and I think, Karl Rahner, one of the great Catholic theologians of the 20th century, this major German theologian, who helped the church when it changed at Vatican II, when it opened itself up. He was one of the great bridge figures from the older scholastic church, you might say, to the inventive church of the post-council period. He died in 1984, so before everything had developed. But I think he realized that one of the problems of the institutionalized church of the past few hundred years had been a great suspicion of mysticism as something exotic that makes for bad participation. That if you're a mystic, if you're a spiritual person, you may just wander off on your own. We just want people who show up on Sunday and sit in the pew and behave themselves and do what we tell them. And Rahner said, no, you have to bring the mystical back into the center of the faith. Because what does it mean to be a Christian? It means to be a companion of Jesus. And what does that mean? It means to open into the mystery of God. And if you're not opening into the mystery of God as part of your life, whether you're a priest or a nun, whether you work for a business, whether you're a teacher, whether you're in government, whatever, somehow that being a mystic, opening into the mystery of God, is part of being a believer. It's like saying, I have everything in place, I'm totally organized, I just don't think I'll breathe anymore. If you don't breathe anymore, then regardless of your health, you'll be dead fairly quickly. And an individual or a church that says, no mysticism, no spirituality, just do what you're told, is going to be dead. And I think Rahner had this great vision that everybody is, in a sense, opening into the mystery of God, and therefore mysticism is an ordinary, everyday part of being a believer.
So let's talk a little bit in our remaining time about interfaith dialogue and understanding, because I know you've dedicated a lot of your focus to bringing harmony between the different religious traditions. And you wrote this great book back in 2010 called Comparative Theology, which I don't know, when I read it, I think it was, I don't know how it was taken in 2010, but it seems like a really advanced sort of opening thought. So how do you see things developing with interfaith contact and harmony since 2010 when you wrote the book?
Well, I mean, I would first of all say that, my book is like one drop in a great ocean, that for the past 30, 40 years, there's been so much writing about interreligious dialogue, interreligious learning, that there's a very large number of people trying to put into words what seems to be, the phenomenon in which we're going to live from now on, that we're no longer religious people living and dwelling in our own tradition only, but to be religious is to be interreligious as well. Perhaps, as some scholars say, this has always been true anyway, but I think everybody's thinking about what are the implications of being in a world where our neighbors belong to other faith traditions. Can we actually learn to do this well? Then I would make a distinction between what I call comparative theology and interreligious dialogue. And the larger, more important reality is interreligious dialogue. Because interreligious dialogue means that in various ways, we are not turned in on ourselves, but we're in dialogue with people of other faith traditions. And this sometimes can come down to a planned meeting. Like we're invited on a certain day and we all sit around the table, and the Christians are in one corner and the Buddhists in another, and the Muslims in another, and the Jews in another, and the Hindus in another. And we can have a dialogue, and we start at 9, we break for lunch, then we finish at 5. Those dialogues are functional, they're institutional, leaders come, and those are good. But I think in the Catholic view, at least, that is one small strand of dialogue. The basic strand of dialogue is, guess what? We all live on the same planet Earth. We're neighbors, we need food, we need clothing, we need clean water. We don't want forest fires burning down our houses. We don't want global warming to flood all the coasts. We don't want insane arms races wasting money on weapons when we need to feed people. We don't want guns killing our children, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things, it's not a Christian problem or a Muslim problem or a Buddhist problem. These are our problems. And so the basic dialogue is what Catholics call dialogue of life. If you live on planet Earth, you need to be in cooperation with people of other faiths so that we can do this together. We can make our best way to make the world livable. Another form is specific action, where you can say, well, look, I'm an environmental group, but I wouldn't say, well, it's a Christian-only environmental group. We don't want anyone else to help us. Or I'm in a Buddhist group against gun violence, but no Christians allowed. Now, that would be crazy. All these work together, even politically engaged organizations. It's not like politics is a dirty word or religion and politics is a dirty thing necessarily. There are all kinds of ways in which people work together in hospitals and schools and government. That is a kind of ongoing dialogue for practical purposes. And then, of course, as we all are aware, I mean, there are the beautiful, powerful, you might say spiritual dialogues, which often come down to sitting together, praying together, sometimes just sitting together in silence. And that can be a powerful dialogue where words fall away and people meditate next to one another. People spend hours in prayer in their own inner space, but with their people of other faiths. And that's, if we don't do that, then the whole thing shrivels and dies. But in the frame of that, the one more is I would say, the intellectual dialogue. And this is where, myself as a professor comes down in saying that we also have been blessed with brains. We've been blessed with knowledge, the ability to learn, the need for study. Well, we might as well study interreligiously as well as religiously. And therefore, we have to be able to learn across religious boundaries so that on the simplest level, we know what we're talking about. And then on a deeper level, we have learned enough from other religious traditions that it changes the way we dwell in our own. So it's wonderful to have a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew together But I also want the Jew who studies Buddhism, the Buddhist who studies Islam, the Christian who studies Hinduism, the Hindu who studies Confucianism, and so on. That we want people who are multi-trained, literate across religious boundaries. And when I use the term comparative theology, it's trying to talk about that. So comparative religion is a wonderful, important discipline, but it tends to be a kind of scientific, historical discipline where we study about religious traditions. But theology as faith-seeking understanding means when I study theologically across religious traditions, it's an intellectual matter infused with my faith. And my faith and my intellect are crossing over and crossing back. So I think while the larger reality is of dialogue in all the different forms, in that space, you need the intellectual exchange of spiritual people who are learning from one another's religious traditions. And that's where the 2010 book comes in. And indeed, much of my work through the years is this kind of intellectual crossing. It's not just, it is academic, but it's not just academic, because it's a matter of knowing kind of a greater wisdom about who we are in the 21st century that can no longer simply be, I know my tradition, you know your tradition. No, we need to know our traditions.
Yeah, and it's especially critical today. I mean, you could make a case that actually there's more conflict today because you have renewed conflicts between Jews and Muslims in the Holy Land. You have Buddhists and Muslims in Myanmar. You have Hindus and Muslims in India, all in conflict with each other.
Yeah,
so how do you, maybe what are your final thoughts that you want to leave us with for some guidance to help people participate in creating more harmony among the faiths, in addition to what you've already said, of course?
Well, I mean, being a person of, trying to be a person of faith, I'm also a person of hope. And I would say, the first thing I would say is that probably there is more interreligious understanding and mutual respect now than ever before in human history, because we just know each other globally so much more, that there are so many ways in which every faith tradition, large and small, is crossing paths. And that except for extreme people who say no to everything, people are learning to live interreligiously, and they know about each other's festivals and their habits and their places of worship. And so I would say, you know, the 98% of the population of the world is learning to be interreligiously in their own faith traditions, in a world also in which there are the spiritual but not religious, and there are secular people. But so the larger frame is, I think maybe we're doing this pretty well. But on the smaller scale, as you say, the horror stories of interreligious conflict and people dividing themselves by saying, well, on this side of the line, we're my religion, on that side of the line, there's your religion, and we're going to defeat you because you're out to get us and we'll get you before you get us. Horrible instances you can find in so many different places. I would say, partly there are horrible people in this world who do horrible things to other people. And there are good people in this world who get caught up in horrible things and then do horrible things. So, you know, in other words, human nature is such that people do harm to each other. And I think it shouldn't all be blamed on religion. But there are also people who, out of, personally, I would say, misguided religious convictions, believe that the only way to defend their faith is to fight with others. And I don't believe that. I simply disagree with that. And also people who somehow believe that if I speak in my faith, I should be able to control the political environment. I should be able to control the government to make sure that my values carry over everyone else's values. And this could lead to warfare, but it also leads to kind of political chaos in certain contexts in which people are, in fact, it's not so much infusing politics with faith, which we would hope would happen, but rather saying, I will use political structures and votes in order to get my views to win out over your views. And that's sort of politics without community and politics without dialogue. So I think in the short run, all these horrible stories, again, should not blind us to the fact that basically we're doing pretty well, but that we should also be grown up, mature, alert people who realize for good reasons and for honest reasons and bad reasons, people will try to manipulate religion to get other secular things or material things. And I think those of us who are trying to be spiritual, and you with your wonderful Sunseed initiative over these past 50 plus years, are trying to show that the negative story, the horrible story, the violent story is not the story. And that the people who believe in extremism, fundamentalisms of various sort, they are not going to win out in the long run. That is not, I would say as a Christian, that's not God's will for the world, because as you said before, Jesus prayed, may they all be one. And I think the prayers of Jesus ultimately come true. And we just have to do our share, even if in our own lifetimes, we may not see the result. But things are heading in the right direction, but that doesn't give us any reason to be lazy or to sit back or to blame other people when we're not doing anything ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, you said it very, very lovely in your book here, Learning Interreligiously, which is actually a compilation of many of the blogs that you did over 9 years. And the very last paragraph of your book, I'll just read a little excerpt. We must be careful, but we must be bold.
Yeah.
We must insist on learning from the lives and ideas and prayers of saints and theologians of all traditions. Are not all saints witness to the glory of God?
Yeah, and that ability, to be humble, to be realizing I am not God, and yet somehow being willing to risk ourselves and do impossible things because God has given us the grace to love. God has given us the grace to be generous, to respond to violence with nonviolence, to be friends to people in trouble. All these impossible things, we have to be able to do them. And if we're so timid, and if we give ourselves all the reasons why I can't do this, then that is not a good reason for any person of faith. We all are called, to put your faith into practice and do good, love your neighbor. And how you and I do this may differ. We all try our different ways, but somehow loving in practice has to be part of who we are as human beings in this century.
So true. So true. Huh? Well, thank you, Father Francis, for your honest and inspiring replies. I'm sure our audience has many questions they would like to ask you, and you've been gracious enough to do another answer later at another time. We'll do another short video for the answers, but ask your questions to Francis Clooney, Father Clooney. You can email your questions. The chat won't. You can do them right now on the chat, but it's better you email your questions to our email at sunseedhelp@gmail.com. SUNSEED help@gmail.com. And now we have a great gift from Professor Clooney. First, I just want to again remind our audience that not to miss our next Wisdom Talk on July 6th with Swami Sarva Priyananda, who will talk about meditation and finding God consciousness in this lifetime. And he's just such an inspiring young monk who's been, not so young, around for maybe, I don't even know his age, I think, but I think he's in his 40s or 50s. But the point is, he's just so articulate. Do you know his age? I know you've met him, right?
Yes, I was privileged to be able to invite him to spend a year at Harvard, 2019-20, which suddenly was cut short by COVID near the end. But he was a wonderful presence in class and on campus, and is so full of life and vitality and vision. I think anyone who can come on July 6th to hear him speak will be totally satisfied by this experience. So I highly recommend hearing Swami.
Yeah, I mean, I've just sat in awe of the way he articulates things from all the traditions as well as from the actual experience. And he's been on you can see him on TED Talks and YouTube and everywhere, but do join us. And please go to our website at sunseed.org so you can get all of our programs, sign up for our mailing list. And now, Professor Clooney, I guess we have a wonderful time with you. I'm going to turn over the talk to you so you can give us some quieter moments. Thank you.
Good. So when Amitat asked me if I would do some kind of meditation at the end, I made clear I'm not a meditation teacher. I'm not a yoga teacher. I'm not a Zen master. I'm a part of this Catholic tradition where we have what's called Lectio Divina, where you read the text in a meditative fashion and allow it to speak to you, which we can't do here in any adequate way. But I thought what I would do is share with you 4 texts. The first one is a Christian text from St. Augustine. The second one is a Tamil devotional text from South India. The third, the beautiful Gitanjali text of Rabindranath Tagore. And the fourth one from the New Testament. And what these 4 texts have in common is that each of them is about being surprised by God, being found by God when you didn't realize God was even looking for you, and perhaps being found by God when you didn't even realize there was a God. And so what I'm simply going to do, because I think we've had a wonderful conversation tonight, is put them up on the screen one by one and simply read them and then leave a moment of silence, and then go to the second, go to the third, and go to the fourth. And I think maybe those of you who want the 4 texts, if you do send in your questions by email, you can also request it, and Amritat can send you the PDF of the text themselves. So we'll do that. So very simple.
Definitely, we will definitely do that.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Again, go to sunseedhelp@gmail.com.
Okay. So without further ado, I'll put them up and say a brief word about what the text is, but not an exegesis of it or whatever. And I think they will speak for themselves. St. Augustine's Confessions is one of the great texts of world literature, certainly in the West and in the Christian tradition, one of the great texts of discovering God in the course of one's life. And here in chapter 10 of Augustine's Confessions, he turns and speaks to God and realizes that the God he is finding is the God who has been finding him from the very beginning. Late have I loved you, beauty, so ancient and so new. Late have I loved you. And behold, you are within, and I outside. And there I searched for you. Deformed as I was, plunging amid those lovely forms which you made. You were with me, but I was not with you. Things held me far from you. Unless they were in you, they were not at all. You called, you cried out, you burst my deafness. You flashed, you shone, you chased my blindness. You breathed odors, and I drew in breath and panted for you. I tasted and hungered and thirst. You touched me, and I burned for your peace. One of the favorite forms of Hinduism that I've loved studying over the past 40 plus years is a Tamil devotional tradition of South India. Tamil is a very ancient Indian language, not related to Sanskrit. It's from the south of India. And Namalvar, namely, literally, our saint, in his beautiful text called the Holy Word of Mouth, Tiruvai Mori, he speaks in his own words about how God found him when he didn't even realize that God was looking, when he realized that he belonged to God, and it was all a surprise of God's grace. In the time when I did not know you, when I was caught up in my great confusion, you made this servant love your service. As an innocent dwarf, you asked, 3 steps of land, Mahabali. You tricked him who did not know you, and now you've mingled with my life's breath. In return for the great good gift of your mingling with my breath, I gave you my life's breath. So what now is left to give back? You are the breath within my breath, my Father who consumed all 7 worlds. Whose is this breath? Who am I? Only that which you made, cave, and kept. Rabindranath Tagore is one of the first really great global international figures from India who is known widely for his little book, Gitanjali, 100 songs or so that came out and won the Nobel Prize, the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, I think 1912 or 1913. Songs, a garland of songs, a Gita Anjali, in which he speaks of his awareness of God, finding God in so many different ways. And like Augustine and Namalvar, he is surprised to realize that God has been finding him before he even imagined that he could search for God. This is not a translation, but this is the words of Tagore himself. Thou hast made me known to friends whom I knew not. Thou hast given me seats in homes not my own. Thou hast brought the distant near and made a brother of the stranger. I am uneasy at heart when I have to leave my accustomed shelter. I forget that there abides the old and the new, and that there also thou abidest. Through birth and death, in this world or in others, wherever thou leadest me, it is thou, the same, the one companion of my endless life, who ever links my heart with bonds of joy to the unfamiliar. When one knows thee, then alien there is none, then no door is shut. O grant me my prayer, that I may never lose the bliss of the touch of the one in the play of the many. And our final passage goes back to the Gospels, the Gospel according to St. Luke, and it's the famous parable of the prodigal son. Much could be said about this parable, as with the other passages I just read, but I've selected only one small part of it. When the young man thinks that he's made a mistake and he thinks he can return to his father and be a servant in the house, and he finds out by surprise that his father has been waiting and loves him more than he can imagine. But when the young man came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands." And so he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. And then the son began to say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. The way to use these texts, I think, is to spend some time with them, to look at them, to read the one, to read the other back and forth. And so to conclude, I will simply show them once again without reading them, and then we will be done. And I'd invite you to look at them and just pick up what speaks to you from each one of them. And then you can do this later on your own. Amen.
Amen. Now, so inspiring and lovely for you to share that with us. We're so grateful to you, Professor Clooney, for giving us your time, but more importantly, for sharing your heart and your soul with us, and the love of Jesus with us. And really, we're so appreciative. Our audience, you can get these texts. Just send us an email to, well, maybe you can just take a picture of them with your cameras. That's the way we do it today. But if you want, I can send them to you in PDF files. Just go to the email of sunseedhelp@gmail.com. And remember, please join our mailing list so you don't miss anything that we have planned for you over the next weeks and months and years. And share today's Wisdom Talk. Today's Wisdom Talk will be available on our website at sunseed.org/Wisdom Talks. It'll also be available on YouTube. I'm sure that some of you have questions that you would just love to ask Professor Clooney. So this is a chance of a lifetime, really. I don't know when you'll have a chance to be with him again. Send all your questions to us at our email, sunseedhelp@gmail.com. And Professor Clooney has agreed to do another short video just answering your questions. So go for it. This is a great opportunity. And don't forget, put this in your calendar, that on July 6th, that is a Wednesday night, at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to have our next Wisdom Talk guest, Swami Sarvapriyananda, who is the head of the New York City Vedanta Center. He's an amazing and deep speaker, and just so practical and lovely. He's done TED Talks and YouTube videos. Go check him out before you come to our program if you like. But bring everyone you know to hear our next Wisdom Talk. I think we're finished. I just want to, again, thank you so much, Father Clooney, for
Thank you, Amrita. You're doing a wonderful thing, and I'm glad to be a small part of it tonight and to be with you.
It's been wonderful. And so to everyone out there, I'm going to leave you now till our next Wisdom Talks with all of blessings and love. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, good morning, wherever you are in the world. May you be blessed. Namaste. Om Hari Om. Shalom Aleichem. Assalamu Alaikum. Jai Ram. May the long time sunseed shine upon you.